to the Developers Who Test podcast, a podcast for developers who embrace test automation so they can ship better quality software faster and have more fun doing it. I'm your host, Chris Harbert, and I'm here today with Matt Watson. Matt is presently the founder and CEO of Fullscale, a company that helps other companies scale their software development teams quickly and affordably. But Matt has also founded 4 companies, including one that exited for over $150 million. So he knows a thing or two about growing teams, scaling them. And today we're going to talk to Matt about when startups should get started with test automation. Today's episode of the Developers Who Test podcast is brought to you by Testery.com. Whether you're a developer who has just a handful of tests or even thousands, then your tests deserve to be running on the fastest and most reliable platform for open source testing. With AI-driven insights and analytics, unparalleled parallelism, and awesome integrations, Testery enables you to get more from your tests. Check us out today at Testery.com. Welcome to the Developers Who Test podcast, Matt.
Well, since I'm a developer and I don't test, I don't know if we have the right name of this podcast today. It should be like Developers Who Don't Test podcast is what it feels like. But testing is important. Excited to talk about it today, though.
Yeah, so let's jump right in. Why would you say you're a developer who doesn't test?
Well, you mentioned the company I sold a long time ago. So that was in 2011. When we sold that company, we had grown it to doing $35 million a year in revenue. It was the number one software in the industry. We didn't have a QA team. We didn't have one automated test. We didn't have one QA person, one manual QA person. We didn't do any testing of any form. We were still very successful. So that doesn't mean we shouldn't do QA, but sometimes I feel like QA is a little more of a luxury than a requirement. And sometimes people overcomplicate things, but QA is definitely important. And if I was going to do a lot of QA myself, I would definitely want it to be automated, because manually QAing 1,000 different things sounds like a terrible idea.
Yeah. So what context were you in where you were able to be successful with creating software but not having testing? Like, who were your customers? What was your system like?
Yeah, so we were selling software to car dealers, and it was a CRM kind of software, marketing. It was all marketing, sales and marketing related software. Now, if our software was down, it was a big deal, but it wasn't like software that flies a plane and the plane falls out of the sky. Like, it wasn't that big of a deal, right? So that's the thing about testing software, is there's definitely different degrees of level of importance, right? Like, in some software, if you don't test it, it's like, okay, this guy can't log in and get his monthly report, whatever. You can log in tomorrow and get it instead, no big deal, right? Versus the plane's going to fall out of the sky. Like, those are very different scenarios. But I think the reason we were successful, I mean, actually back then, I don't know that automated QA was all that of a common thing as well. But we had a very small team that was really, really good developers, and we just shipped good quality code. And when we did screw things up, we fixed it really, really quickly. In some ways, we probably got lucky. I don't know, but we managed to not have much QA. When did automated QA become a big thing? Do you know?
Oh gosh, I wrote my first automated test for a website probably in 2003, which at this point is like 21 years ago.
But it was way harder back then, right? We didn't have Cypress and Playwright and all these different frameworks. You had Selenium. You had Selenium, or probably something before that.
Yeah, so when I got started, it was web application testing in Ruby. It was called Water. And then there was Wattage, I think, which was web application testing in Java. And they were really some of the earlier frameworks that I think Selenium may or may not have been around, but that was just where I got started. And one of the issues with testing through the UI then was the browsers were not built with testing in mind back then. And so when you wanted to write some software that would manipulate the browser, you're using low-level Windows APIs that have terrible documentation, and you're really trying to get the browser to do something it wasn't built to do.
Now that's kind of fun.
Forward, if you fast forward 20 years to today, every version of Chrome ships with a version of Chrome DevTools that has debugging ports enabled so that you can specifically control the browser using automation. So it's a thing that they've built the browsers to do today, which is a big reason why it's so much faster and more reliable than it was 20 years ago.
No, I'm laughing because actually some of the first software I ever built 24 years ago was basically the same as browser automated testing, because I was building bots to buy tickets from Ticketmaster.
Hmm.
And it was browser automation. So ironically, I guess my career has come full circle.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where I started. And, trying to buy tickets for Madonna or NSYNC or whatever. It was like, over 20 years ago. And I wrote software that automated the Internet Explorer, like embedded in Visual Basic 6. It was like ActiveX controls and whatever.
Oh,
Yeah, it was
yeah.
a whole different kind of janky browser automation then, for sure. But it worked. I mean, we automated the browser and bought tickets from Ticketmaster and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. So browser automation has definitely come a long way. That said, browser tests are still inherently slower than unit tests.
Yeah.
They're more expensive to create, maintain, and execute than unit tests. So there is this school of thought that says, hey, your test should look like a trophy. And the biggest layer of testing you should have should be your integration tests, mostly these days at the API layer, when you have single page web applications that are interacting with an API. The API is really doing a lot of the heavy lifting there. And so if you have more tests at the API layer, the idea is they'll be less expensive to execute, more reliable because they're not interacting with UI. The danger in that is that there's some things that you can't test at the integration layer as well that as you can test them at the UI layer. So I think having a pretty balanced approach to testing is still worth doing.
Well, that's the problem, right? Is every kind of application is wildly different. So one of my companies today, we basically automate a bunch of ads on Google Ads and Microsoft Bing's ads. Integrating directly with Google's ads and like building a bunch of automation around that, it's like would be a giant pain in the neck. I guess you could try and mock all of it, but the trying to do that kind of integration test is really hard and complicated, because you'd have to have like a brand new clean Google Ads account every time and then do all this stuff and do all these scenarios, and it's just complicated. So we don't do it. I wish we did, but we don't. But then I had a different kind of example of integration testing. My previous company was called Stackify, and it was an application performance monitoring tool like Datadog, New Relic, and things like that. And we had a profiler for .NET, for example, that I worked on, and we had to take the output of the profiler and run it through all this logic to figure out, okay, what database queries did the code run and how long did it take and whatever. I had to create like hundreds of these integration tests to test all this different output, like gigabytes of output. And it was the only way we could have ever done this. Like our software would have never, ever worked without these integration tests, because one little change in the logic would mess up one scenario from, this one app and this one thing versus another. And like, there is no way we could have ever survived without those integration tests. They were absolutely critical to us.
So I like that you said you're a developer who doesn't test, and then now you're providing examples of tests that you've written. But I think that highlights how, there are certain problems where testing just makes sense, right? And
but developers don't test, right? Like even at my one of my companies at Capacity today, we have a QA guy. It's like, okay, for this Google Ads thing, it's like we have a UI to configure it and save the database. And of course, he comes along and he's like, well, if you put everything in caps and save it, it blows up when it sends it to Google, because Google doesn't allow all caps. And I'm like, dude, nobody is literally ever going to do that. Why are you killing us with a bunch of Jira tickets about putting everything in all caps? But that's what QA people do, right? Like they test all these weird scenarios that the normal developer was just never going to think of, because they're like, why the hell would you type all this shit in all caps? Like, what is wrong with you?
Yeah, well, I think that helps highlight why context matters, right?
Yeah.
So, there are some instances where if somebody did type something in all caps, it could blow things up and cause
Yeah.
a lot of damage for the company in terms of like lost revenue. So, I mean, you can make the case that, okay, well, that's probably an edge case that doesn't really matter for us. But like, let's say, let's say you're an advertising agency that runs $1 billion a year in ad campaigns, and you're creating a B2B application that's used by 20,000 different locations. Seems like you might want to prevent them from doing something that could blow up your whole system, right?
Yeah, I mean, but you said the right word. It's like edge case, right? And that's the problem with, I think, testing and QA in general is how much time do you spend chasing all the edge cases versus the 80-90% case. And
Mhm.
I'm curious, how do you think about that? How do your customers think about that? Because I feel like you could spend forever on the, well, what if it's all caps, or what if it's too long, or what if they put in Chinese characters, or what, one of my developers the other day, like we had the maximum bid amount on Google, and he's like, it can only be 9 digits long. I'm like, dude, nobody's going to put in like $75 billion as their daily ad bid or budget, or like, it's going to be okay. It doesn't need to be more than 9 digits. But if you want to QA stuff, right? Like that's all the stuff. So it's like, they're all sort of edge cases.
Yeah. So I think that's where having the balanced approach to what layer you're testing at is so critical, right? So unit tests are almost free to make. Like you just come up with an idea of, okay, this is, for these requirements, here are the 10 different scenarios I need to think about. Boom, boom, boom. You might write 10 unit tests in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And those unit tests might take 50 milliseconds to run. You're running them before every commit. It's at least documenting, here's what my business rules were in the form of an executable specification. So for the amount of time you invested in that, you're getting a pretty large return on your investment. Just, if nothing else, having the documentation of what did we decide to make the code do.
Well, and I agree, as long as
That's
there's actually business rules, right? Like at
Mhm.
Capacity, that same Google ad software, we have a business rules that has all this logic around, is it weekends, and what is their capacity, and how many appointments they have scheduled, are we going to show ads, are we not going to show ads? Like there's all this complex kind of business rules, and we have a whole battery of unit tests around it, because like you would have to, like there is just no
Mhm.
way to know, like, oh, if I change the code, what am I going to break? Like you have to have these unit tests in those scenarios. But then you have people out there that unit test like every database query and then mock every database query, so it doesn't actually run the database query anyways. Like
Mhm.
some people go to the extreme of like, you're not testing a business rule at that point. You're like really not, you're testing a fake mock thing that you could fake mock and do anything with. So I'm all for it if it's like testing like actual business rules and logic.
Mhm. Yeah, so it sounds like you're a little more of a fan of the trophy approach, where you have fewer unit tests, a larger set of integration tests, and then fewer UI tests. Uh,
I would
or would
rather
you
have
say
more.
like none in any
No,
of those
I'm
categories?
more. I'm a fan of testing anything that has business rules. Like if there's a whole lot of conditional logic and if statements and all that kind of stuff, yeah, it probably makes sense to have unit tests around them. But no matter how much unit testing you do, you still need some form of integration test and UI test, because let's face it, when you get to production, you get to the real world, stuff's just different. It doesn't matter what your unit tests are. All of a sudden you get to production, and like somebody has bad database data, or missing a column in the database, or like all the different things are going to happen that in your perfect little unit test world don't happen, right? Like, so when you get to production, you still need a battery of integration tests and UI tests, basic smoke tests, all that kind of stuff. Like you still need those. You can
Mhm.
actually live without the goofy unit tests that test mock data of things that aren't real.
Yeah, so it sounds like your issue is more with blindly testing every edge case for things you don't possibly think could happen, and
Yeah,
investing a heavy amount of time in that, versus spending time actually testing the business rules, in particular when they're complex business requirements. So
for sure. Yeah, I'm more of a fan of that.
yeah, so like let's say you're starting a new startup. You've done this 4 times. You're going into your 5th one. Uh, at what point would you start doing some kind of testing, and what kind of testing would you start with?
Well, I would start with unit testing the complex business rules. I mean, that's what we did at Capacity. Is we had all these Google Ads, logic, and all that, and we had to build unit tests around it because complex logic. Um, I wish we could have. I wish we could have better testing with Google themselves, but that's just like really complicated to figure out how to do. I'm sure there's a way. I'm sure somebody's listening, like, oh, there's an easy way to do this. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know the easy way. If you do, dude, sorry. Um, but we need to create some basic UI tests. We still haven't created them. We actually were trying to use some third party like no code tool that hasn't been working very well, and that's why we haven't got it done over the last 3 months. But I think I'm going to switch tools. But yeah, that's where the mode we're in now is we need to create some basic smoke test and basic UI test kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah. So, what's your thought process when you decide to do that? In terms of like what tools you would select, who's doing it? Do you pick a senior developer on the team and say, "Hey, go find a tool here"? Uh, like,
Well,
what's your thought process for how you get started with that?
like most developers, I'm not an expert on QA tools. Um, and actually, at Full Scale, we did a survey across all of our teams because we have a lot of QA people that do work for us at Full Scale. They work for our
Mm,
clients, do all sorts of stuff. We did a little survey, and I'm curious your thoughts are. But the three tools that came back the most were Selenium, Playwright, and Nightwatch that were
mm,
used the most. Um, that are kind of low code tools, right? And I'm sure there's a lot of similarities and a few differences between those tools. I'm not an expert at all of them, but I was trying to use like a no code tool. I was trying to use one that was all sort of just only point and click, like go to the login screen, type it in, hit login. Like
mhm,
there is no code. It was all no code. And like I had used Rainforest QA before, and it had a pretty cool tool for that. It definitely had its limitations, but it was super easy to build those sort of just point and click tests. And then you very quickly hit a wall somewhere. You're like, well, I can't make it more dynamic than this.
mhm.
No doubt. But it was really cool for just like a really basic smoke test. And I recently was trying to use some other vendor that was supposed to be able to do all the no code and a little bit of the low code too, all in like one platform. But we've struggled to get their platform to kind of work.
Mm. Yeah, I think one of the struggles that they've had, it really goes back to the earlier days of record and playback, where there was this dream of, well, we'll just record what the users are doing and then we'll play it back, and that'll be our automated test. And I think the biggest challenge with that is there's a principle, I think it's Joel Spolsky promotes, called the leaky abstraction. And it's this idea that anytime you try to abstract away complexity, you have to watch out for cases where the abstraction uh, wasn't able to cover that. I'm not maybe not describing it the best way, but the abstraction doesn't cover the scenario you're trying to accomplish today. And whenever that happens, now all of a sudden you have to fall back on the core implementation instead of your abstraction. And the risk in doing that is now you don't have the team, the processes, the infrastructure, the tools in place potentially to do that. So, if you're going out for a no code solution, you might find that you can automate 80% of the tests in 10% of the time. And that seems like a really good return on your investment. But then you get to that 20% of the tests that you struggle with, and you're either stuck where you just can't do anything because the tool doesn't support being extended, or you're
Yeah.
falling back to, okay, well, now we need to learn the underlying tool anyway to do it. And if we need to learn the underlying tool anyway to do it, are we still getting the full benefits out of the rest of it? Um,
Yeah, or you end up with multiple tools, right? It's like we use this no code thing for these tests, but we had to use Cypress for these other ones or whatever,
yeah,
which is
yeah,
kind
and
of the way it goes in IT, anyways. You end up with all the tools eventually.
yeah, and I think the other challenge that some of those tools face is, you know, the they're focusing on the test authoring side, A lot of them are more so
Yeah.
on the test maintenance side. And the more expensive part of having a good, healthy test automation suite in place is how do you keep this thing running smoothly over time in a way that you don't have to spend a lot of time changing things. And so if you can very quickly get a whole bunch of tests in place, but they're constantly breaking every time a component changes because they're not getting updated at the same time the code is, then that can also be a challenge with that kind of approach. And then I guess the third thing, and this is probably the bigger one, is most developers don't like to use no code tests or no code tools in general. So
Well,
they're in their IDE, they're writing code in, TypeScript, JavaScript, Java. If you ask them to go write a test in a no code tool, they're like, "Well, hey, I'm already in my IDE, I'm already in the code, I'm a coder." And so if you're trying to get developers to do the tests, they're not going to want to use a no code tool. It's just
yeah.
that's my experience. It doesn't matter if it's rational or not, they're not going to want to, right? So I typically see the no code tools being done in environments where the developers are only responsible for code and then there's a separate team responsible for the testing. Now, you can debate whether or not that's a good idea, and there are some cases where maybe it is a good idea. There are probably more cases where it isn't. Uh, but if that's the kind of setup that you have, then it might make sense to have that separate team trying a
Yeah.
no code approach.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think you really hit on the dynamics where every team is totally different. And so, yeah, currently my team, we have one QA person on my team at that capacity. We have one QA person, and I've got like 6 developers. And yeah, the 6 developers don't create any kind of. Sometimes they create some unit tests, but they don't do browser tests and stuff. So yeah, you're absolutely right. But if we were using Playwright or something like that, it would be a lot easier for them to throw down a short file of a new test case that they could run. And honestly, that's probably what we should do. And this tool I've been trying to use, we've been struggling with. I think it's what I'm going to do anyways. But I think you bring up a great point. It's like, who is responsible for doing the testing? And I think we always will need dedicated QA people because they just think about things in a different way. They're like the weirdos that think about putting everything in all caps. Developers just don't think that way, right? Like developers don't look at something and are like, how can I break this thing? Like developers just don't think that way, right? They just don't. And that is where QA is great, is they, I guess, want to see the world burn and they are thinking of every way to do it.
Yeah.
And we need those people, but they're not developers usually, right? But we need developers to at least do the happy path anyways.
Yeah. Well, so what I'm seeing more and more of, and I think is a trend, is the skills required to be a good developer and the skills required to be a good tester are overlapping more and more every day.
Yeah.
So companies aren't looking to hire developers who don't know how to test, and they're not looking to hire testers who don't know how to write code. They really kind of want both, and ideally in the same person if they can get it. But I think what you're highlighting on is there's definitely a difference in personalities and skills and experience. And so if you're a tester who develops, maybe you still know how to write TypeScript and Java code. Maybe you're really good at refactoring and you know your design patterns and all that because you're a true engineer. But you come to it with this personality of how can I pull this thing apart and break it and see how it really works. Versus the developer who tests, who's more like, I really want to wow the customer. I want to get some new functionality out there as quickly as possible. They get their enjoyment from seeing that customer go, wow, that's really cool. And if that's why you're into writing code, is to get that, wow, it's really cool. It's way too easy to just jump straight to putting something out there without considering the all caps scenarios, right? So I think more and more we're going to have teams that do both, but we're going to need to balance those personalities on the team so that you still got people who really want to wow the customers and bring that positive energy of how do I get something cool out the door as quickly as possible. And you want to balance that with people who look at the system critically and say, well, what's going to happen if this doesn't work? And did I really find everything I need to find before we're going to go live with this?
Well, and I think tools like Playwright and Cypress and stuff make this easy to do. It's sort of like building unit tests. Building unit tests feels more like writing software. It doesn't feel
Mhm.
more like you're the QA guy. And if you're the QA guy, it's like you spend all day long just trying to break things. Versus if you spend just a few minutes here or there writing unit tests, it's not a big deal. It's like it's not your full time job trying to break stuff. You're just trying to
Mhm.
build these tests, and the tests can actually be helpful in helping you build whatever you're trying to build. And I think the newer browser automation stuff is the same way, right? It's just as easy as making a little script, and potentially if I'm working on some new field today in the customer ad screen or whatever, I can copy some other script, add a couple things to it, and then run it. And
Mhm.
it doesn't feel like I spent all day doing QA work. It just feels like I modified a script for 5 minutes.
Mhm.
And I think that's the difference, right? Is having better tools where it makes it easy for them to do. Now, are they going to think of every possible QA scenario when they do that? Probably not. But will they at least have created a couple basic scenarios and you have like some basic test coverage? Probably, right? And I think it
Mhm.
would be easy for them to do that. And I think that's what we need, right? You can still have QA come by and be like, I looked at the requirements and there are 75 different ways we should test this thing, and they can go crazy doing that. But at least the developers are able to use it in some degree, as you mentioned, maybe as a productivity tool. Like it actually helps them get
Mhm.
things done faster because just like a unit test is, this is almost like a unit test of the browser. But you need the right tools to do this, and these modern tools are making it feel a little more like a unit test.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I started out as a developer, and then early in my career was fortunate enough to join a team where we were doing test-driven development. So not a single line of code went to production without first having an automated test in place. And I think from that, I got an appreciation for how there are certain tests which absolutely are a productivity tool for developers. So they help you create better code, which means that you're not coming back and revisiting the same code over and over again. Um, so should probably pause on that a second. That's a really important point. Some of the teams I work with, if they have more than 80% code coverage for their unit tests, they're spending maybe 5-10% of their time on bugs. If they have, say, 40-50% unit test coverage or less, they might be spending half their time on bugs. So when you're talking about developer productivity, imagine the team that spends 5% of their time on bugs versus the team that spends 50%. They might be the same size, and one team is almost twice as productive just because they're equally as busy. They're working the same hours. They're just as smart, but the tasks they're working on are different, right? So that's one key part of it. But I think there's also just you're building an API, you wrote the endpoint, you got to run the endpoint, right? And if it only takes you a couple of minutes to get a test in place for the endpoint that you're going to run 1,000 times over the next 5 years, like, wouldn't you want to do that? I think you would. So um, I think that's where I agree with you. There is this inclination to just come up with all of these crazy inputs and what are the craziest inputs we can put into our tests. But at the same time, like having some basic tests in place, I mean, it seems essential these days, I would think.
Well, and I think there's two sides of this. You have like the proactive side and you have the reactive side, right? And I think in my career, I've always been more focused on the reactive side. So I've done a little less of QA, but I've always been really good at reactive. So if there was a problem, I knew immediately and I could jump in and I could fix it immediately. And maybe that's why I was less proactive. And probably some of that stems because I had an APM company that, like New Relic and Datadog and all these things, that's what
Mm.
we did. We built software that was very reactive. So if you ship new code to production and it threw an error, we would know about it immediately and we could go fix it immediately. And I think no matter how much unit testing you do, integration testing you do, TDD, automated testing, no matter how much of all of those things you do, it doesn't even matter. You still got to be good at being reactive too.
Hmm.
Like you can try and test everything in the world, but when you ship this thing to production and then the database just times out, like you got to know that the database is timing out because you are not going to catch that in any testing, right? Or some jackwagon put the wrong data in there, or messed up the SQL conversion script, whatever it is, like the 1,000 different things that can still break in production. You still have to be reactive to those things. And I think for part of my mindset all along was like, if I'm really, really good at being reactive, I didn't need to be quite as good at being proactive. But I think we need both. Ultimately, we
Hmm.
need both. The better we are being proactive is important. But I just want to point out, like, people also need to be good at being reactive to when things do go wrong. Having that data and those insights is also just as important. Because if
Hmm.
that's a black hole, then nobody will know that those problems are existing, how to troubleshoot them, how to fix them. I think that's also as important.
Yeah, I'm really glad you bring that up because I think too often we I mean, the goal of testing is quality, right? And you can't have quality if you don't invest time on the requirement side of, are these requirements the right requirements? Are they consistent with other things we've done? Did we really think everything through? And I don't think you can have great quality, and at least initially, and you'll probably hit a bottleneck over time if you're not doing some testing along the way. But definitely a third aspect of getting to quality is how do you respond to issues when they happen. So I really like that you bring that up because I think as testers, we get very myopically focused on pre release verification. And then once it hits production, that's somebody else's problem. And it may even be a different team altogether, right? Um, I think a good story that highlights your point here is, I was working on a team where we did invest heavily in test automation, and we would go live, and without question, the next morning, sometime between 9 a.m. and 9:30, we would get at least one or two tickets
Yeah,
from somebody on our support team
every
who
time.
said, or it was actually not somebody on the support team, it was a account management team who said, "Hey, trying to do such and such for a client and just came across this issue." And if you're doing a good testing strategy, the issues that are going to happen are less severe, but there were still issues, right? And so it got me wondering, and I said, "Well, what is this person doing that we're not?" And it was the fact that they were interacting directly with customers. They were doing the same things that customers would be doing, and they were very familiar with the customer's business requirements and needs. And so, they come in at 9 a.m. and they try to do this customer flow. They're paying attention to things we didn't know that we were supposed to pay attention to. They're looking at data and they actually understand what the data is about because they know who the
Yeah.
customer is and what the customer is doing. So they have all this context that the engineering team doesn't have because their job is to be with the customers all day long, right? And so we made a simple change. We said, well, let's just have this person take a look at the QA environment for 30 minutes the day before the release. Do whatever you would do in a normal day, just do it in the QA environment for 30 minutes. And that meant we were finding those issues before the release instead of the day of the release, and it had a big impact on our quality, even though it wasn't a traditional approach to testing. So I really like that idea of being reactive, but also, take that being reactive and don't just repeat it as a cycle, but take that being reactive and how can you incorporate that into your process so that you're finding those issues before the release instead of after the release.
Well, better testing in a staging environment, I think is kind of what you're alluding to is valuable and important, right? Is having a cleaner environment that's more real world to test with. But the part of my point too was just being reactive in production because things are going to happen that you cannot plan for and you cannot test
Mhm.
for. Like for example, January 31st this year, Google deprecated their version 13 of the Google Ads API. If you were using it, at UTC February 1st, midnight, you were down. It just stopped working. And guess what? That happened to us. So unless we weren't doing a good job of monitoring production, we got hit by it. And you're like, well, Matt, why didn't you know? It's like, because every 3 months they sunset damn version of the API. So you're like forever chasing what version you're on, and it's pain in the neck. We learned our lesson. But point is, like, those kinds of things just happen. It doesn't matter how much you plan for anything in the world. That kind of stuff's going to happen in production as well. And you've got to be able to have better monitoring for all that kind of stuff to know when it happens too. Because be it third-party integrations that don't work the right way, or the database in production is slow, or whatever, like there's a multitude of things that are also going to happen there that you just can't plan for ahead.
Yeah. Did you do a root cause analysis after that happened and get folks together and just say, hey, what could we do next time to detect this?
I put a reminder on our calendar for when the next version sunsets. that was the postmortem. September 1st, make sure we're not using version 15 anymore because it's going away. So that's all we can do.
I mean, I think that's important though, even if it's a simple action that you can do that's not expensive to do. I think what drives me nuts is, and drives most of our customers nuts, is when the same issues keep happening over and over again. And that can be a great place to inject testing, but it can also be a great place to just change your business practices and, add calendar reminders if that's what's needed to get things queued up. Like my cable provider, for example, or my internet service provider, regardless of what the issue is, the only thing that they can do is schedule that a technician comes out, and the technician comes to your house and they look at your router and everything is set up the same way that it was set up before. And so they keep coming out, and then it keeps going down. They keep coming out, it keeps going down. And I'm looking across the street, and there's a person with a shovel who's digging up the cable, and they're from one company. And then the next corner down, I kid you not, this is a true story. It happened just a couple weeks ago. The next corner down was a different ISP. A guy was also working on the same cables and had this really confused look on his head, scratching his head. So I'm pretty sure the reason that I didn't have internet service that day was because there were two people working on the same line, constantly switching things, disagreeing with each other on what the right configuration should be.
Pretty much describes production right there.
Yeah, and I had zero way of communicating this to the support team. The support team was totally disconnected from anybody who had any ability to do anything. And so what I was told was like, hey, your internet's not down. Like, yeah, it's down. They're like, well, we don't have anybody working in the area. I said, well, yeah, it's a different company. I can see them. They're right there. And I'm just bringing that up because I think it's, it's what you mentioned about the being reactive, good customer service, reacting to production issues that can't be anticipated, kind of involves closing that loop with engineering of getting back to the people who can actually fix the issues or prevent them from happening to begin with. Otherwise, our customers are just going to be stuck in this loop of, hey, the system goes down every 3 weeks. Like, why does the system keep going down? And it's unreliable.
And, as we talked about, your podcast about developers who test or don't test. Related to this is developers suck at this too, like monitoring production. They don't care about monitoring production for problems either. I built a whole company that was geared on trying to solve that problem and spent years trying to talk to developers and get them to be better at using these kinds of DevOps tools and whatever for production. Most of them don't care. They just want to go write code. They don't want to spend time monitoring production. They don't want to spend time doing QA. They just want to go write code. That's what they want to do. And so it was always a struggle for us too of getting them to even use the tool. It's like, hey, you have visibility to know there's these performance issues or these errors in your code, all these kinds of things. But it's just not in their DNA. It was like always a struggle. Now, granted, some of them would do it. The leaders would do it, the CTOs, stuff like that. Like, because, their rear end was on the line if the software didn't work in production. But your average developer, it was really hard to get them to wrap their head around using application logging and errors and APM tools and observability tools, like all this kind of stuff. They just struggle with it, probably for the same reason a lot of them struggle with QA. It's just like they just want to write code. Like they can't. There's just too many things to be an expert at too, as part of the problem.
Yeah, that's been a common theme on this podcast, the balance between specialization and generalization. Like, do we want people who specialize in certain areas of software development, or do we want to create this, mythical full stack, I can do everything engineer?
Plus be an expert at QA, plus be an expert at deploying code and CI/CD and monitoring production and AWS, and the list goes on and on and on.
Yeah, so I've gotten a little pushback on this concept because people say, well, we do like generalists and we have good reason for it. But at the same time, we don't do this in other sections of the business. We don't say, you know what, we want marketing people to also be salespeople and finance people, because there are a lot of benefits if you know how to do all three at the same time. If you know how to do all three at the same time, then you become an entrepreneur, right?
Yeah.
But that's a hard thing to ask everybody to be an expert at everything. And anytime we ask somebody to be an expert at more than two or three things, I feel like we're kind of devaluing what it takes to do those two or three things. So, if you think that you can write code and you can write tests and you can monitor production and you can know how to interact with AWS services and you can know how to interact with databases, you can get there. It could take your career. But
you're never going to be an expert at any of those things.
Yeah, you're still going to find that situation where, I don't know about database sharding in Postgres.
No.
And I missed the fact that Postgres doesn't create indexes for foreign keys because I was too busy learning about Ember and Ember.js and how to do two-way binding on the user interfaces, right?
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of like really nuanced complexity in all of these jobs that we have. And I think whenever we try to combine them all into one role, we're just asking for people who don't know how to do certain things. And maybe for your business, that's okay. But if you're doing a business where that kind of stuff matters, losing that specialization could mean that you don't have a database that performs, or it could mean that you don't have a website that can do cutting edge animations to wow people with new experiences, right?
I think the most important thing is having leadership that is more generalized, that at least understands what all of those things are and what is possible and what does good look like, right? Like they know we need QA automation. We need unit testing. We need to monitor production. We need to make sure Postgres works and scales the right way. Like they don't need to be an expert in all those things, but at least they know that they're important and they kind of know what good looks like, right? Like they know what winning looks like. So even if they're not the expert at how to do it, they know that they can hire somebody that can come in and figure it out and knows that we can solve the problem and that it's possible to solve and what good looks like, right? I think that's what's important is you got to have somebody at the leadership level that at least has enough generalization across all these things to understand that like how to do things the right way, even if they're not the expert at how to actually do them. So we need generalists at a higher level for sure.
Yeah. And I think that's good. I guess what you want to be able to recognize is this a problem that's unique enough to my business that we need to solve it in a special way? Or is this a problem that everyone has and is pretty well solved and the general solution is good enough?
And that is a problem every single month at almost every single software company. And so, for example, it's like, this month we're working on QA automation, or we're working on Elasticsearch, or working on sharding Postgres, whatever it is, right? You're like, we don't know how to do that. So do we spend 4 weeks trying to figure it out? Or do we hire the consultant for $300 to come in and tell us how to do it, right? But that happened. That's like every month. This is a new topic, right? Because you're always got this new project, this new thing, this new technology. It's never ending. So, as software developers, we have to always just be learning all these new things. And you got to have people that are smart. They can just learn to do these new things. Or you just line up a whole bunch of consultants.
Cool. All right. Well, we're about out of time here, but I really want to thank you for coming on the podcast. Once again, we've been talking with Matt Watson. If you want to check him out, he's currently founder and CEO of Fullscale. He's got other things going on constantly, so check out his LinkedIn profile. And he's also the founder and host of the
Startup Hustle podcast. Is that what you're going to say?
Sorry. We'll clean that up on the edit. The Startup Hustle. Sorry. He's also the founder and host of the Startup Hustle podcast. So I really recommend that you check that out as well. So thank you for coming on our podcast, Matt.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm going to go back to testing now.